The wind carried a strange silence that morning, a silence heavy with the smell of wet earth and iron. Beyond the cotton fields, the first light of dawn crawled across the horizon, brushing the world in gold and blood. Somewhere within that light, a boy opened his eyes, not to freedom, but to the sound of chains. His name was Isaac, though names meant little to those born in bondage. To the world he was property, but deep inside him burned something no whip could ever silence, the quiet. Trembling wished to be free, and miles away, under the same sun but in another world entirely, a girl named Evelyn Carter sat by her window, reading a book her mother had given her, Voices of Liberty. She was born free, taught that every soul was equal in God's eyes. Yet she knew the land she called home was built on stolen breath, and that someday, somehow, she would have to decide what that freedom truly meant. But before we continue with this disturbing story, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who loves hidden stories. It helps bring more of these untold truths to light. The year was 1858, deep in the heart of Louisiana, a place where beauty and brutality danced side by side. The plantations stretched farther than sight could reach, the fields alive with the rhythm of forced labor. Isaac was 15, his back already hardened by years under the southern sun. His mother, Ruth, had been sold when he was barely 10, and his father, well, Isaac never knew if he lived or died. But every night, when the world slept, Isaac would whisper her name under his breath, like a prayer the stars might still hear. "Keep your head low, boy," the overseer used to say. "Low heads live longer." But Isaac's eyes, they were never truly low. They carried a fire, a knowing, something dangerous for a man who had no rights to his own life. Across town, Evelyn Carter lived a life wrapped in silk and civility. Her father, Charles Carter, was a respected lawyer, one of the few men in the South who quietly opposed slavery, though never loudly enough to risk his wealth or name. Evelyn, however, carried her convictions like open wounds. She read abolitionist newspapers from the North, wrote letters under false names, and dreamed of a world where no child was born in chains. But dreams, in those days, were dangerous things. One night, as thunder cracked over the plantation, Isaac found himself staring at the sky. The rain came down like forgiveness that would never reach him. He had heard whispers that men were escaping north through the Underground Railroad, led by people who risked everything to free strangers. Freedom. The word sounded holy, almost too big for his mouth. He didn't yet know that destiny was already weaving him into that path, through pain, through fire, and through a woman he had never met. That woman was Evelyn. It began, as most stories of fate do, with an accident, or perhaps a calling. Her father had taken her to visit a nearby plantation, the Beaumont estate, under the guise of attending a charity gathering. Evelyn had never seen such cruelty up close. The sight of men and women bent over fields, their hands bleeding into the cotton, froze her soul. That was where she first saw Isaac. He was young, tall, shoulders broad despite the years of toil. But it was not his body that caught her attention. It was the look in his eyes. Defiance, fire, life. In a place built to kill the spirit, he still carried his own. For a brief second, their worlds touched. A glance that neither could name, nor forget. The days turned into weeks. Evelyn began secretly sending food and bandages through one of the kitchen girls, a quiet act of rebellion, but in those times, such kindness could get a person killed. And Isaac noticed. He never knew who it was that left the small loaf of bread behind the barn door, or the clean cloth folded near the well. But he felt it, like a message from a world that had not yet forgotten him. Then one evening, as the sun bled into the trees, fate decided to strip away their distance. The overseer had accused Isaac of slowing down work. The punishment was swift and merciless. Evelyn, who had stayed behind in the main house to help her father with papers, heard the screams before she saw the whip. Her feet moved before her mind could stop them. She ran into the courtyard, and there he was on his knees, blood tracing the dust beneath him. "Stop," she cried, her voice cutting through the humid air. The overseer turned, whip still raised, his eyes narrowing. "Miss Carter, you best stay inside. This ain't for your eyes. But she didn't move. She stood between the whip and the man it sought to break. That night marked the first time Isaac saw her face, not as a blur from afar, but clear as the moon. And in that moment, something inside him shifted. Not love, not yet. Something deeper. The realization that even among the free, there existed souls that refused to look away. After that night, the air changed between them. Evelyn couldn't forget what she'd seen. She wrote in her journal, his eyes were not of a slave, but of a man who remembers what freedom feels like. She began meeting him secretly, first to tend to his wounds, then to speak, to listen, to understand. In those hushed conversations, beneath the shadow of magnolia trees, they built something fragile, a bridge between two worlds that were never meant to meet. Isaac told her of his mother's song, a lullaby about rivers that ran north where no one could be owned. Evelyn told him of the book she read, of a world changing beyond the horizon. For a moment they both believed that perhaps destiny could be rewritten by the will of two hearts. But the South was not a place that forgave such dreams. Rumors began to spread. The overseer had noticed glances, movements, whispers. One night, he followed Evelyn into the fields, saw her leave a candle burning in the barn, saw Isaac waiting there. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The next morning, Isaac was gone, sold to another master farther south. Evelyn's heart shattered in silence. Her father said nothing, but his eyes told her he knew. "You must forget, child," he whispered. "The world is cruel to those who love beyond its laws." But how does one forget the only person who ever made freedom feel real? The months passed. The war between North and South began to loom, the air thick with politics and prophecy. But Evelyn's war was quieter, fought within her chest. Every sermon, every polite conversation at the dinner table, every law her father defended, it all felt hollow. She began writing again, but this time under her own name. Her words, filled with quiet fire, started to travel, published anonymously in abolitionist newspapers. Her voice became part of a movement. And somewhere, miles away, Isaac was still alive, barely. He was now owned by Colonel Whitmore, a man known for his cruelty and his wealth. Isaac had stopped counting days, but one night while working near the docks, he overheard sailors talking about the coming war, and about a woman named Evelyn Carter, whose words had stirred trouble among the rich. He didn't know if it was her, but he wanted to believe. The story of Isaac and Evelyn was far from over. The world around them was about to catch fire, and destiny, that silent puppeteer, was ready to pull every string it had, because love, even when buried under chains and centuries, always finds a way to rise. The nights in Georgia were different, heavier somehow, as if the air itself mourned for the souls it could not save. Isaac lay awake beneath a broken roof, the smell of iron and sweat thick in his lungs. He had been sold 3 times since that night on the Beaumont plantation. Each new master promised more pain, more silence. But inside him something refused to die. The memory of her face, Evelyn, burned like a candle that no cruelty could extinguish. He had no letters, no words, nothing to prove she had ever existed. And yet, every time he closed his eyes, he could still hear her voice whispering his name through the thunderstorm. Somewhere in his heart, he knew she had not forgotten him either. By 1861, the world around them began to unravel. The Civil War had torn America in two, the Union to the north, the Confederacy to the south. Every city was split between loyalty and conscience, and every heart between duty and truth. In New Orleans, Evelyn Carter's home had changed too. Her father had passed away suddenly. Some said illness, others whispered it was the strain of the war. Whatever the reason, his death left Evelyn alone, with nothing but the words he once told her. The world is cruel to those who love beyond its laws. But Evelyn had already chosen her side. She began working secretly with abolitionists, using her family's connections to smuggle information and aid escaped slaves heading north. They called her the White Flame, a symbol of light in a land swallowed by darkness. And though she never said his name aloud, every life she helped set free felt like a promise, a silent message carried to him. I am still fighting for you. Far south, In the brutal camps of Colonel Whitmore, Isaac's days had blurred into years. The colonel had begun using his slaves to build fortifications for the Confederate Army. Every stone Isaac lifted, every lash he endured, was part of a war that wasn't his. But one evening, he overheard something that changed everything. A group of soldiers spoke in low voices near the fire. "There's talk of the Yankees advancing through Tennessee. They say there's a woman in New Orleans, writes letters, helps the runaways. They call her the White Flame." Isaac froze. That name, that fire, it could only be her. That night, under a sky torn open by lightning, Isaac made his choice. He would run. Escaping the Whitmore estate meant certain death if caught. But Isaac had long stopped fearing death. What terrified him more was dying without ever being free. So on the third night after the full moon, when the guards were drunk and the wind howled loud enough to drown the sound of his heartbeat, he ran, barefoot, bleeding, chained no longer. The dogs came first, their cries splitting the silence like knives. Then the shouts, the gunfire. He ran through swamps and shadows, every breath a prayer, every step a rebellion. When the bullets stopped, the night swallowed him whole. He didn't know where he was going, only that he was heading north, towards a name whispered by fate itself, Evelyn. For weeks he moved by instinct, following the stars, drinking from muddy rivers, stealing food from empty barns. Once he found refuge with an old couple, freed slaves themselves, who gave him shelter and whispered of safe houses run by people of the Underground Railroad. "Follow the North Star," the old man said, "and listen for the hymn. When you hear 'Swing Low, Sweet Chariot,' you're close to friends." Months passed before Isaac reached the outskirts of New Orleans. The war had turned the city into a nest of soldiers and spies, every face a question of survival. He could no longer walk freely. His torn clothes marked him as an escaped slave. But destiny, as always, had its own plans. One rainy evening, he found himself at the docks, helping an old dockhand load crates onto a wagon in exchange for food. As the man lifted a lantern, a voice echoed nearby, soft, firm, unmistakable. "Be careful with that cargo. It goes to St. Mary's Orphanage before nightfall." Isaac froze. It couldn't be. It had been years. But that voice, that calm authority wrapped in kindness, he would know it anywhere. He turned, and there she was, Evelyn Carter. Older now, the innocence replaced by quiet strength. She wore a dark coat, her hair pinned back, her eyes fierce and focused. She moved through the chaos with purpose, unaware that the ghost of her past stood only a few feet away. Isaac wanted to call out, to say her name, but fear caught in his throat. What if she didn't remember him? What if the world she lived in no longer had space for a man like him? Before he could decide, soldiers appeared, searching wagons for contraband. Evelyn turned sharply, her expression hardening. "We have orders from the mayor himself," she said, holding out forged papers. Isaac watched her stand tall before men who would have killed her for helping his kind. The soldiers inspected the crates, found nothing, and moved on. Evelyn exhaled, relief flickering across her face. And that was when their eyes met. For a heartbeat, the world stopped moving. Her lantern light fell across his face, older, scarred, but unmistakably him. Her hand trembled. "Isaac?" she whispered. He didn't answer. He couldn't, but his eyes did. The same fire she had seen all those years ago, still burning. They stood there, two lives torn apart by war and fate, meeting again in the one place neither belonged. Then the spell broke. Evelyn stepped forward, pulling him into the shadows. "Come with me," she said, her voice shaking, "before they see you." That night in the hidden basement beneath St. Mary's, they spoke again for the first time in 6 years. The air was thick with disbelief and unshed tears. "I thought you were dead," she whispered. "I was," he said softly, "but something kept me moving. Maybe your voice." She looked at him, at the man he'd become. Stronger, colder, but still carrying that same light. "What happened to you?" she asked. "Too much," he said. "But none of it matters now. I just need to know, why are you still here? Why haven't you left?" Her eyes glistened. "Because freedom means nothing if I turn away from those who don't have it." He smiled faintly. "You always were the brave one." In the days that followed, Isaac became part of Evelyn's secret network. He helped guide runaway slaves through the back streets of the city, hiding them in carts, leading them to safe houses beyond the river. Together they built a quiet resistance, one small light at a time. But danger was closing in. The Confederate patrols had grown suspicious of the orphanage, and whispers began spreading that someone from high society was aiding fugitives. Evelyn's name was being spoken in places it shouldn't be. One evening, a coded message arrived from the north. They know. You must leave immediately. Evelyn stared at the letter in silence. If I go, she said, who will help them? Isaac stepped closer. If you stay, they'll hang you. Her voice broke. And if I leave? Will you come with me? He looked at her, truly looked. Years of pain, fire, and longing swirled between them. Evelyn, he said quietly, I've been running my whole life. Maybe it's time to stop. That night, they tried to move the last group of refugees across the river. The rain fell in sheets, drowning the sound of footsteps. They were almost there. The first breath of freedom did not feel like the songs had promised. It was cold, thin, heavy with the smoke of a world still burning. Isaac awoke to the sound of wind howling through the cracks of an abandoned church. His body ached, his shoulder burned, and his mind floated between dream and fever. Evelyn sat beside him, her face pale with exhaustion, her hands trembling as she changed the bandage on his wound. You're safe, she whispered, though her voice carried no certainty. We're across the line now. They can't reach us here. Isaac tried to speak, but his throat felt dry as sand. All he managed was a hoarse, broken smile. Freedom. He had imagined it all his life. Yet now that it was real, it felt almost unreal. Too quiet, too uncertain. Outside, the war thundered on. Cannon fire rolled in the distance like storms over the horizon. The Union Army was pushing southward, freeing towns one by one, yet every victory came painted with the blood of men who looked like him. Freedom, it seemed, had a cost, and Isaac was still paying it. Days turned into weeks as Evelyn nursed him back to strength in that ruined church near Cincinnati. They lived on little, stale bread, rainwater, kindness from strangers who didn't ask questions. At night, the flicker of firelight painted the walls in trembling gold. Isaac would sometimes wake, his breath sharp, haunted by the sound of whips or the baying of hounds. Evelyn would hold his hand and whisper, You're here now. You're free. But freedom, he was beginning to learn, was not just about chains. It was about what those chains left behind. One evening, as the war winds shifted, a group of Union soldiers arrived in the town. They were young, faces dirt-streaked and eyes weary. Among them was a man named Captain Henry Dalton, who recognized Evelyn from her writings. You're the White Flame, he said quietly. Your letters, they reached Washington. You've saved lives, Miss Carter. Evelyn smiled faintly. I've only tried to save a few souls from the fire this country built. Dalton's eyes moved to Isaac, standing silently beside her. The captain's expression hardened, not out of cruelty but habit, the kind of silent distance white men carried toward black men even when calling themselves allies. He extended a hand. You served then? Isaac hesitated. I survived, Dalton nodded. Sometimes that's the same thing. That night, Evelyn sat with the captain by the dying fire. The Army needs people like you, he told her. We're forming a group to help the freedmen, teachers, nurses, anyone who can give them a start. Evelyn looked at Isaac. And him? Dalton shrugged. If he can work, there's labor. But no guarantees. Even freedom has rules now. After the captain left, Evelyn turned to Isaac. They'll never see you as equal, will they? Isaac's jaw clenched. Maybe not, but they'll see me standing. By spring of 1863, Isaac joined the United States Colored Troops, one of the new regiments made up of former slaves fighting for the Union. Evelyn begged him not to go. I've just found you, she said, tears tracing her cheeks. I can't lose you again. He took her hands in his. You gave me freedom, Evelyn. Now let me fight to keep it. He left the next morning before dawn. She watched him walk away, his back straight, the rising sun turning him into a shadow swallowed by the mist. The war was merciless. Isaac saw men die with freedom still on their tongues. He saw brothers fight brothers and blood soak the soil that once held chains. Yet in that chaos, he found something he'd never known before. A sense of purpose. He wrote letters when he could. Simple words, scrawled in rough handwriting. The world is bigger than I ever thought. Eve, but even out here I see your light. They call us soldiers now, not slaves, and that for me is enough for today. Evelyn read every word as though it were scripture. She worked in the refugee camps that followed the army, teaching children, healing the wounded, spreading what little hope she could. But deep down she knew every battle won could be lost again with a single law, a single lie. Because true freedom wasn't written in the smoke of war. It had to be carved into the bones of the nation itself. Then came the letter she feared most. It arrived in winter, carried by a tired messenger wrapped in blue. Her hands shook as she unfolded it. The ink was smudged by rain. The 54th was sent to Fort Wagner. We were outnumbered. The air was fire. I'm alive, but barely. I keep thinking of your face when you said my name that night in New Orleans. If I don't make it, tell the world I died, believing I was a man, not a slave. Evelyn read it again and again until her tears blurred the words. Then she looked up at the sky, gray, endless, indifferent. Matrin whispered, "No, you will make it. You have to." Months passed with no news. Every knock on the door, every shout in the camp made her heart race. But one morning, as snow melted into the earth, a figure appeared at the edge of the road, limping, thin but unmistakable. Isaac. She ran to him, dropping everything in her hands. He caught her mid-run, his arms trembling from exhaustion and disbelief. For a long time they said nothing, just held on, as if letting go would break the world again. He was different now. His face older, his eyes deeper. But when he smiled, it was the same. That quiet defiance, that stubborn spark that refused to die. "I told you I'd make it," he murmured. Evelyn pressed her forehead to his. "You made me believe again." The war ended 2 years later, with the South in ruins and the nation reborn through ashes. The Emancipation Proclamation had become law, and for the first time in history, millions of men, women, and children were free. But freedom, Isaac realized, was only another kind of battlefield. In the streets of the new America, signs still hung that said, "Whites only." Men like him were called free, but paid less, watched more, beaten still. Evelyn saw it too, the same hypocrisy dressed in new words. One evening, as they walked through a half-burnt town, Isaac stopped before a broken courthouse. "They say we're free now," he said, "but I still can't vote. I still can't walk into a store without them watching me like I stole something." Evelyn placed a hand on his arm. "Then we'll build something of our own. A school. A place where they can't unteach freedom." And they did. Together they started a small schoolhouse for freed children on the edge of Nashville, teaching them to read, to write, to dream. Evelyn taught letters and scripture. Isaac taught history and courage. The children called him Mr. Isaac, the man who used to be a slave, now the man who taught them what it meant to be human. But history has a cruel way of testing those who challenge it. In the summer of 1867, the night riders came, men in white hoods carrying torches, shouting lies about purity and fear. They burned homes, schools, and churches, anything that dared to remind them the world had changed. Isaac stood in front of the schoolhouse as the flames approached, Evelyn behind him. "Go inside," he said. "No," she replied. "I'm done hiding." They stood together as the mob advanced. Isaac didn't carry a weapon, just the calm of a man who had survived worse than death. When the first torch flew, he caught it and threw it back. The night erupted in chaos. By dawn, the riders were gone, leaving ashes where dreams once stood. But the school still stood, half burned. Roof caved in, yet standing. Evelyn sat on the steps, covered in soot. "You could have died," she whispered. Isaac smiled faintly. "I did, once, on a plantation in Louisiana. But this time I came back for something worth dying for." As years passed, the world began to change again. Slowly, painfully. The children they taught grew up to become leaders, preachers, teachers, voices of a new generation born from the ruins of the old. And in their twilight years, Isaac and Evelyn would often sit by the window of their small home, watching the sun set over the same kind of fields that had once held chains. "Do you ever think about what might have been?" Evelyn asked one evening. Isaac smiled. "Every day. But then I remember, what we lived was enough for 1,000 lifetimes." She reached for his hand. "Do you ever regret it?" He shook his head. "Not once, because for a moment we made the impossible real." Outside, the wind carried the laughter of children playing, free, unafraid, alive. And though the world was far from perfect, it was enough. Because freedom, as Isaac had learned, was not a place, it was a choice. A fight, a promise kept. The months that followed were carved with silence, the kind that doesn't rest in the air but lives inside people. Nathan had not seen Ada since the night she escaped the marsh. He'd heard whispers among the townsfolk. Some said a young woman was taken by soldiers on the road to New Orleans. Others claimed she vanished across the river under the cover of a preacher's wagon. But in his heart he held one truth: Ada was alive. Somewhere beyond the reach of chains or cotton fields, breathing beneath the same sky. The plantation had changed. The war was tearing across the land like fire through dry grass. Every day riders brought news of new battles: Antietam, Vicksburg, Gettysburg, words that meant nothing to the enslaved except that men were dying for something called freedom. But Nathan knew what that word felt like. It was Ada's hand in his, her breath trembling with defiance. Freedom wasn't an idea. It was a heartbeat. One evening, as the horizon burned orange behind the magnolia trees, a Union scouting party appeared near the plantation. Their uniforms were ragged, their faces hollowed by hunger and miles of war. The overseer fled before them like a dog, leaving the fields and their workers behind. For the first time, Nathan stood unchained in the open, the air thick with the scent of gunpowder and rain. A young soldier dismounted, his voice sharp but not cruel. "You a slave here?" Nathan looked at the man, at the blue on his coat, at the dirt beneath his nails. "Was," he said. The soldier nodded slowly. "Not anymore." That night the Union Army camped by the river. Fires flickered between the trees, men whispered prayers for home, and Nathan stood apart, staring into the darkness. For the first time, he was free, and yet he felt the weight of absence heavier than the chains he'd lost. Every breath carried Ada's name. Days later, he followed the Union troops north, helping them mend fences, guide through swamps, and bury the dead. They called him Brother Nathan, and he carried their water, patched their wounds, listened to their stories. But his own story, the one that mattered, remained unspoken. He kept it inside like a sacred flame, untouchable. When the army reached New Orleans, Nathan's world shifted again. The city was chaos, soldiers marching, merchants shouting, women selling bread beside cannons. But amidst the madness, hope lived there too. The streets hummed with rumors of freedmen's schools, of papers that granted liberty, and of a woman who preached about freedom under a big oak tree on Royal Street. Her name was whispered like a prayer: Ada. Nathan froze when he heard it first. Then again from another man who said, "That lady's got the kind of voice that makes even the generals listen." He followed the trail for 2 days through the city, down mud-streaked alleys and across crowded squares, until he reached the square where people had gathered in a hush. And there, standing beneath the wide arms of an old oak, was Ada. Her hair was shorter now, her clothes plain but clean, and her face. It carried the quiet strength of someone who had seen the worst and still chosen light. She was reading aloud, a letter written by a soldier who'd died for the cause of freedom. Her voice trembled but never broke. Nathan didn't move. He just watched her, as if time itself had stopped breathing. When her eyes finally lifted and met his across the crowd, the world fell away. The noise of the city vanished. The years of pain, fear, and longing folded into a single moment of recognition. After the gathering, Ada approached him slowly. Neither spoke at first. Words felt too small for what had survived between them. Then she smiled, the same way she had the night she'd promised they'd meet again. "You found me," she said softly. "I never stopped looking," he replied. They sat by the river that night. where the city lights shimmered like stars caught in water. Ada told him of her journey, how she'd escaped the soldiers, how a group of freedwomen had taken her in, teaching her to read, to write, to speak for those who couldn't. She had found purpose in her pain. Nathan told her of the plantation's fall, of the men he'd buried, of the new world slowly rising from ashes. They were both survivors, carrying scars that told the same story. But freedom, they realized, was not the end. It was only the beginning. The world they dreamed of had yet to be built, and the fight was far from over. "People think freedom is a gift," Ada said, her voice quiet but steady. "But it's not. It's a burden, one we have to carry until every soul can share it." Nathan nodded, looking out across the river. "Then we carry it together." And in that moment, beneath the moonlight and the hum of the sleeping city, they made a silent vow to build something out of the wreckage of what was lost. Not just for themselves, but for all who still waited in darkness. As the war raged on beyond the horizon, Nathan and Ada began their work, teaching, speaking, helping others find their names again after years of being called nothing. Their love became a quiet rebellion, their hope a living testament. But destiny, the same force that had torn them apart once, was not finished with them yet. For on a distant road leading toward Georgia, a name from Nathan's past stirred once more. The master who had owned him had survived the fall of his empire, and now, broken and bitter, he sought vengeance against the man he once called property. The past was not done with Nathan, and the cost of freedom was about to rise once more. Freedom had come, but peace had not. The war had ended in fire and song, and the streets of New Orleans echoed with celebration and ruin alike. Men who had once been slaves now carried papers of liberty. Women who had once been owned now walked with heads unbowed. Yet the air was thick with something new, not the sound of chains, but of anger. The South was broken, and some hearts refused to let go of what had been lost. Nathan and Ada lived on the edge of the city, in a small wooden house with white shutters and ivy creeping up its walls. It wasn't much, but to them it was a kingdom built on ashes and hope. Each morning, Ada taught the children of freedmen, boys and girls who once hid from the sight of books, now learning to write their own names. Nathan helped rebuild homes, working with his hands as he always had, but now for himself, not for a master. They lived quietly, humbly, and with gratitude. Yet every sunset carried a whisper of something coming. One evening, as Ada dismissed her students and closed the small door of their schoolroom, she found Nathan waiting by the porch, his hands stained with earth and his eyes dark with thought. "You've been restless again," she said softly. He looked at her, then past her, to the horizon. "They say old Master Harlan's alive up north." "Georgia way." Ada's voice trembled slightly. "And if he is?" Nathan hesitated. "He won't let it rest, Ada. He's lost his land, his money. Everything. Men like him don't forget. They rot in it." Ada stepped closer, her hand finding his. "Then we don't hide from ghosts. We've already buried them once." He smiled faintly, though his jaw stayed tight. "You always talk like freedom can't die." She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the soft glow of the oil lamp. "Because it can't, not if we keep breathing." That night, the city was quiet except for the river's low murmur. Nathan lay awake beside Ada, staring at the ceiling where moonlight painted thin silver lines. He could still remember Harlan's voice, the drawl, the cruelty folded in politeness, the whip that sang before it struck. Freedom hadn't erased those memories. It had only given them edges sharper than ever. Days passed. The tension in the streets grew thicker. Freedmen were being threatened, schools burned, teachers beaten. The war had ended, but the hate had not. One morning, Nathan returned home early from work, his shirt torn and his lip bleeding. "A group of riders," he said, breathing heavily. "They're coming through the parishes, calling themselves regulators. They're burning places that teach freedmen to read." Ada froze. Her hands trembled over the book she was holding. "The school," he shook his head. "It's safe for now. But we can't trust that'll last." That night, Ada refused to close the school. "If they burn it, we'll rebuild it," she said. "They can't burn the words out of the children's minds." Nathan watched her with awe and fear. She was fire-wrapped in grace, the kind of courage that frightened even him. The next week brought the storm. It came at dusk, Thunder rumbling, wind thrashing, and hooves echoing on the road like a drumbeat of death. Nathan was outside when he saw them. 6 riders, faces hidden by cloth, torches blazing. The lead horse stopped near the fence. A voice rose from the dark. "We don't want no trouble, boy. Just tell your woman to stop filling heads with lies." Nathan's blood went cold. He knew that voice. The years had worn it, but not enough to hide it. Master Harlan. Nathan stepped forward slowly, his face pale beneath the flickering firelight. "You shouldn't have come here," he said. Harlan laughed, a dry, broken sound. "You talk like a man now. Funny thing hearing that from something I once owned." The men behind him chuckled low. Ada appeared at the doorway, her lantern glowing behind her, illuminating her face. When Harlan saw her, his smirk faded. And there she is, the preacher woman, filling up heads with dreams that don't belong to her kind. Nathan's hands clenched. "You lost your war. You lost your right to talk." Harlan's eyes narrowed. "You think war changes blood? Freedom don't change what's bred in the bone." The torchlight wavered as thunder cracked above. Nathan stepped closer. "No," he said quietly, "but it changes what a man can do with his hands." And then the rain broke, a sudden fierce downpour that drowned the firelight. The riders cursed, backing their horses, their torches hissing in the wet. Harlan turned to retreat, but his eyes met Nathan's one last time, and in that look lived every cruelty, every injustice, every wound that never healed. "This ain't over," he spat, before galloping into the dark. Nathan stood there long after they vanished, the rain running down his face, his fists trembling not with fear, but with rage. The old rage, the one he had buried to survive. Ada came to him, wrapping her arms around his soaked shoulders, whispering, "Don't fight ghosts, Nathan. Fight for the living." He nodded, though he could feel something stirring deep within him, something that told him Harlan would return. In the days that followed, the city tried to move on. Nathan rebuilt the fence the riders had broken. Ada went on teaching, though she kept one eye always on the road. Every night they prayed the same prayer, that the past would finally stay buried. But one morning, as the sun rose red and heavy, a stranger arrived at their door, a young boy no older than 10, shivering and barefoot. He carried a note in his small, trembling hands. Nathan opened it, and the words made his blood run cold. "You took my land. You took my pride. Now I'll take what's yours. H." Ada saw the color drain from his face. "What is it?" she whispered. He looked at her, his voice barely holding steady. "It's starting again." Outside, the wind picked up, the sound of hooves somewhere far, far off. The storm was coming back, and this time it wasn't just the past knocking at their door. It was vengeance. Dawn came heavy, gray, and waiting. The air itself felt like it was holding its breath, as though the world knew something was about to break. Ada stood by the window, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, eyes watching the road that curved into the trees. Nathan sat by the table, the crumpled note still clenched in his fist. He hadn't slept all night. There were no soldiers now, no armies left to protect them. Only the echoes of a war that had freed their bodies but left the world still half in chains. Freedom, Nathan had learned, was fragile. Something you had to guard, not just with laws, but with courage. He rose, picked up the old rifle hanging above the hearth, and checked its worn chamber. "Nathan," Ada said softly. "Don't." He turned to her, his face lined with years that hadn't passed yet. "If he's coming, I can't let him bring that darkness back here. Not to you, not to these children." Ada stepped closer, her hand resting over his. "And if you fight him, you bring it back yourself." He looked down, the weight of her words pressing into his chest. "Then what do I do, Ada?" She met his eyes, steady, calm, and unbroken. "You stand, but you don't let hate tell you how." Outside, the wind whispered through the fields, carrying with it the distant rumble of hooves. They came at midday. 6 riders again, their coats dark with rain, their faces masked. At their center rode Harlan, older now, his skin sallow, his eyes still burning with that cruel fire Nathan remembered from the fields. The years had taken everything from him except his hatred. Nathan stepped out to meet them. No weapon in his hands, only the strength in his stance. Ada stood behind him on the porch, her hands gripping the edge of the railing. The children from the school were gone, hidden away with neighbors hours earlier. Harlan reined his horse a few yards away. "You should have run, boy," he said. "You had your chance." Nathan's voice was low but clear. "I did run. I ran toward life. You're the one still chained." A flicker crossed Harlan's face. Not fear, but the briefest spark of something human, something lost. Then his lips curled. "Talk's cheap." He lifted his pistol. The sound that followed cracked through the air like thunder. For a moment no one moved. Nathan's eyes widened, not from the shot, but from where it came. Ada stood at the porch, smoke curling from the barrel of the rifle. Her hands were steady, her breath calm. The bullet had struck the pistol clean from Harlan's grip, shattering it against the ground. "Go," she said quietly, her voice echoing through the stillness. "Go home, Harlan. There's nothing left here for you but ghosts." The riders shifted uneasily. The war had ended, but the sight of a woman standing fearless before them, it unsettled something deeper than any bullet could. Harlan's eyes darted from Ada to Nathan, then to the ground. He dismounted slowly, his boots sinking into the mud. "You think this world's going to keep you safe?" he spat. "You think your freedom means they'll ever see you as equal?" Nathan's voice softened, but it carried. "No, but I don't need them to see it. I just need to live it." For the first time in his life, Harlan found himself facing a man he could not own, could not control, and could not break. He looked smaller than Nathan remembered. Not the towering figure of fear, but just an old, tired man who'd built his life on the wrong side of time. Rain began to fall again, soft and cold. The world, it seemed, wanted to wash something clean. "Get out," Ada said quietly. And they did. Harlan turned his horse without another word. The riders followed, their torches dying one by one in the rain. When they vanished beyond the trees, Nathan let out a long, shaking breath. The rifle slipped from Ada's hands, and he caught her as she staggered forward. "It's over," she whispered. He nodded, his forehead resting against hers. "It's over." Weeks passed, and the rhythm of life returned, not as it was before, but as something new. The school reopened. The fields began to grow again. Children laughed where once there had been only silence. But something in Nathan had changed. He no longer carried the weight of his past like a curse. Instead, it had become a story, one he told others who still feared to believe in tomorrow. Sometimes, when the nights were quiet and the river shimmered under the moon, Ada would sit beside him and read aloud. Letters from freedmen, from soldiers, from mothers who'd lost everything but hope. Words that filled the air like prayer. One evening, as she read by the window, Nathan said softly, "You know, when I was a boy, I used to think God had forgotten me." Ada smiled faintly. "And now?" He looked at her. The woman who had crossed every boundary to find him. The one who had taught him that freedom wasn't something given, but something lived. "Now I think he was just waiting for me to wake up." She closed the book, leaned her head against his shoulder and whispered, "Then let's never sleep again." Years later, people would tell their story like legend. The freedman and the preacher's daughter who built a school from the ashes of a plantation, who taught a generation to read and believe in their own names. They'd say Nathan and Ada changed their corner of the world not with guns or power, but with grace that refused to bend. And when the old house finally fell quiet, when time carried them home to rest side by side beneath the magnolia tree, the city still remembered, not their suffering, not their pain, but the light they left behind. Because in the end, freedom wasn't about escaping the past. It was about building something beautiful enough that even the past couldn't touch it. If you love the darkness, stay with us. Subscribe before the lights go out.